All right, so how does this play out? John Hardie is standing by. John is the Deputy Director of the Russia Program at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies in the U.S. John, good to see you. Thanks for taking the time for us today.
Thanks for having me on.
All right, what's going to happen tomorrow? What do you think? We're hearing about a call between Trump and Putin, a possible big announcement. Your thoughts?
I think one objective for President Putin is to try to tie any agreement on a ceasefire to an understanding on the basic kind of framework principles for a long-term peace deal. So I think, as Putin kind of alluded to this in his remarks of the day, that the Russians want essentially to lock in some of their major concessions before agreeing to stop the fighting. So things like Ukrainian neutrality, a preclusion of Western peacekeeping forces in Ukraine after a war, certain things that really President Trump should not be accepting at all, or especially as part of a ceasefire agreement.
I mean, as you know, the Russians started this war. Whatever their thoughts are on, NATO encroaching in their backyard, they still triggered a war that's, killed a lot of people. Do you think they are going to be pushed to make any sort of concessions, or are they going to be allowed to hold on to, 20% of Ukraine's territory? Ukraine has to be neutral, cannot join NATO, no European peacekeepers in Ukraine to police any kind of ceasefire. I mean, is that possibly what we're looking at here, John?
I think President Trump has been very clear that he does not support or not try to help Ukraine retake its territory. He's been clear on no Ukraine in NATO. I think what's important and where the potential trade space is on some of the things I just mentioned. So Putin pushing for example, no Western peacekeepers in Ukraine. Well, Trump has said he supports the European-led idea for a reassurance force, so-called, in Ukraine. On the other hand, the Russians are pushing for peace talks to proceed on the basis of the what's called the 2022 Istanbul Agreement, which would have, among other things, precluded those peacekeepers. So President Trump will have to be careful to avoid kind of giving away the farm in this conversation with Putin. He'll have to be careful not to agree to something that would preclude the types of security guarantees Ukraine will need to make sure any peace agreement that emerges from these negotiations is durable.
Hey, John, you're an expert on Russia, so let me ask you a blunt question. Can Putin be trusted?
Absolutely not. The Russians violate basically every agreement they sign. And I think whatever deal comes out of these negotiations, it's unlikely to resolve the fundamental question at stake in this war, which is, can Russia make Ukraine a vassal state similar to Belarus, or will Ukraine be free and independent? The Russians have failed to accomplish their goals through military means, and they're trying to impose on Ukraine some conditions that, frankly, Kyiv just isn't going to accept. No Ukrainian leader is going to accept being a leader of a vassal state. And so I think, unfortunately, what's going to happen is that this war will kind of remain inconclusive, and the chances of a follow-on conflicts will be very, very high, regardless of whatever happens in this deal, which is why security guarantees for Ukraine are so important.
Yeah, I mean, you wonder what's in it for Vladimir Putin at this point, John, to end this conflict when his forces are making slow but, steady gains. They're pushing the Ukrainians out of the Kursk region as well. On the other hand, he's got this interesting relationship with President Trump that he may not want to undermine as well. So if he's seen as not negotiating good faith, I mean, could that trigger an angry reaction from Trump?
Well, Trump has hinted on this, and I think he really needs to make sure that that threat is credible in his conversation with Putin. And if Putin is unwilling to give ground here, Trump needs to follow through. So targeting things like Russia's oil revenue, for example, by really clamping down on Russia's so-called shadow fleet that ferries its oil across the world. That's a great way to show the Russians that Trump means business, and also to kind of shorten the period that Russia's economy can sustain this war.
Hey, one last question about one of the main people who is sort of negotiating for President Trump. This is Steve Witkoff. You're familiar. I mean, this guy is a real estate billionaire from New York and a longstanding friend of Donald Trump's. He's not a diplomat. I'm not sure what his expertise on Russia actually is. Are you concerned that, he may be outmaneuvered by somebody like Vladimir Putin, who, as you know, I mean, came from the spy world and has been, basically Russia's leader now for 25 plus years?
I think President Trump has some experienced folks around him. I think what's more important than trying to focus on whether he'll be outmaneuvered is President Trump going to follow through on what he's stated very clearly, which is that if the Russians aren't going to play ball, he will penalize them. He's kind of slapped Ukraine around a bit, for better or for worse. We might all have thoughts on how he handled that, but regardless, he's done that to Zelensky. Now he needs to be prepared to do the same to Putin if he wants to actually bring both sides together to a deal.
John Hardie is my guest, Deputy Director of the Russia Program at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Hey, John, thanks for taking time for us in Canada. Great to have you and your expertise.
All right, thank you.